Between 1822 and 1824, something happened on a rice plantation near Georgetown, South Carolina, that made even the most hardened overseers refuse to work there. 17 documented incidents, 43 unexplained injuries, and one enslaved man whose name was systematically erased from every plantation record, yet whose actions were whispered about in slave quarters across 3 counties for the next 40 years. The local magistrate's private journal, discovered in 1963, contains a single entry about him. "We have created something we cannot control. God forgive us for what we did to make him this way." What transformed a man into something that terrified the very people who enslaved him? What pain could forge someone so dangerous that his own enslavers tried to erase his existence? The answer lies buried in the meticulous records of Georgetown's most profitable plantation. And what you're about to hear will make you question everything you thought you knew about resistance, survival, and the true cost of cruelty. Before we continue with the story of the man they tried to erase from history, I need you to do something important. Subscribe to this channel and hit that notification bell, because stories like this, stories they tried to bury, need to be told. And leave a comment telling me what state or city you're listening from. I want to know how far this story travels. The story begins not with violence, but with an arrival that seemed ordinary by the brutal standards of 1819. Georgetown, South Carolina, in the spring of 1819 was a town that ran on rice and cruelty in equal measure. The Waccamaw River meandered through the low country like a serpent, its banks lined with plantations that produced some of the finest rice in the Americas. The humid air hung thick with the smell of pluff mud and the distant sound of work songs that drifted across the water during the endless growing season. The Fairhaven plantation, owned by Marcus Hewitt, sat on 1,200 acres of prime bottomland. 300 enslaved people worked its fields, their lives measured in bushels harvested and tasks completed. Hewitt had inherited the property from his father and had built his reputation on 2 things: the exceptional quality of his rice and his equally exceptional cruelty. Other planters whispered that he was too harsh, that his methods bred rebellion, but they couldn't argue with his profits. 8,000 barrels a year, each one stained with suffering that no ledger could quantify. The overseer, a weathered man named Silas Drummond, had worked for the Hewitts for 23 years. His face was lined like old leather, his hands scarred from years of wielding the tools of his trade. He prided himself on his ability to manage enslaved people, that peculiar euphemism that meant breaking spirits without breaking bodies too badly to work. He'd seen hundreds of people pass through Fairhaven's gates, and he believed he could measure a person's character within a week. He would be wrong about that. On a humid May morning, a coffle arrived from Charleston. 17 people chained together, their eyes hollow from the 100-mile march. Among them was a man who'd been given the name Samuel by his previous owner. He stood just over 6 feet tall, broad-shouldered from years of labor, with hands that showed the calluses of someone who'd worked iron. The auction records listed him as approximately 26 years old, trained blacksmith, purchased from the estate of Thomas Radcliffe following bankruptcy. What those records didn't mention was that Samuel had been sold 5 times in 7 years, that each sale had come after unexplained incidents at the previous plantation, that the smile he offered to Drummond during that first inspection contained something other men might have recognized as a warning had they been paying attention. Samuel's wife, Clara, stood beside him in the coffle, her hand gripping his despite the overseer's order not to touch. She was 4 months pregnant, though she'd hidden this fact during the auction by wearing loose clothing. Their 2 children had been sold separately in Charleston, sent to different plantations inland. Samuel had watched them go, his face expressionless, while something inside him had calcified into something harder than the iron he used to forge. Fairhaven's slave quarters consisted of 40 wooden cabins arranged in neat rows behind the main house, each one housing 6 to 8 people. The structures were built from raw pine, already weathered gray by the salt air and rain. Gaps between the boards let in mosquitoes during the warm months and cold during the winter. Samuel and Clara were assigned to cabin 14, sharing the space with 3 other couples and 2 children. The plantation operated on the task system common to low-country rice plantations. Each enslaved person was assigned a specific amount of work to complete each day, a task that typically took 12 to 14 hours during the growing season. Complete your task, and theoretically, your time was your own. Fail to complete it, and punishment came swiftly. The system seemed more humane than the gang labor used on cotton plantations, but it was merely cruelty dressed in different clothes. The tasks were calculated to push people to their physical limits, day after day, year after year, until their bodies gave out. During those first weeks, Samuel worked in the fields like everyone else, learning the rhythm of rice cultivation. The work was backbreaking, standing ankle-deep in water infected with snakes and alligators, bending thousands of times each day to plant or harvest, breathing air thick with mosquitoes that carried fevers. His blacksmith skills, which had commanded premium prices at auction, went unused. Hewitt had his own blacksmith, an aging man named Joseph who'd been working Fairhaven's forge for 30 years. Samuel was simply another pair of hands in the fields, another body to extract profit from. But Samuel watched everything. He observed how Drummond moved through the plantation, the routes he took, the times of day he checked on different work areas. He noted which enslaved people held positions of slight authority, the drivers who enforced the overseer's orders, the domestic servants who heard conversations in the main house. He watched how punishments were administered, how resistance was crushed, how hope was systematically extracted from people until they became the walking dead. And he waited. Clara grew weaker as her pregnancy progressed. The fieldwork and inadequate food took their toll. She tried to hide her condition as long as possible, knowing that pregnant women were sometimes given lighter tasks, but were also viewed as less valuable, more likely to be sold away. When her pregnancy became impossible to conceal, Drummond reduced her task slightly, but added insult to the small mercy by assigning her to collect night soil from the main house, work considered particularly degrading. On a sweltering July evening, as Samuel and Clara sat outside their cabin after the day's work, she spoke softly about the children they'd lost. "I dream about them," she said, her hands resting on her swollen belly. "I dream that Thomas still remembers the song I used to sing to him. That little Mary remembers my face." Her voice caught. "But they'll forget us, won't they? They'll grow up and we'll just be ghosts to them." Samuel didn't answer. His hands gripped his knees, knuckles white, and his jaw worked as if he were chewing on words too dangerous to speak aloud. In that moment, something shifted behind his eyes, a calculation being made, a decision taking shape in the darkness of his thoughts. The incident that changed everything happened 3 weeks later, on a Monday morning when the heat already shimmered off the rice fields at dawn. Clara collapsed while carrying water to the field workers. The pregnancy had weakened her more than she'd admitted, and the combination of heat, poor nutrition, and exhaustion simply overwhelmed her body. She lay in the mud between the rows of rice, unconscious, while the other workers gathered around her. Drummond arrived within minutes, summoned by one of the drivers. He looked down at Clara's prone form with the expression of a man calculating the cost of a damaged tool. "Get her to the sick house," he ordered, "but her task still needs completing. Samuel, you'll finish her work today on top of your own, or you'll both taste the lash tomorrow." Samuel stood perfectly still for 3 long seconds. The other workers stepped back, recognizing something in his posture that Drummond, in his arrogance, failed to notice. When Samuel finally spoke, his voice was calm, almost conversational. "No." That single word fell into the humid air like a stone into still water. Drummond's face flushed red. In 23 years of working plantations, he'd heard enslaved people plead, bargain, weep, and scream, but outright refusal was rare enough to be shocking. "What did you say to me?" "I said no." Samuel's eyes met Drummond's without wavering. "You'll tend to my wife properly. You'll call for the doctor. You'll make sure she and the child survive. And I'll finish both our tasks." The audacity of it stunned Drummond into momentary silence. An enslaved man didn't make demands, didn't negotiate, didn't speak to an overseer as if they were equals discussing terms. The proper response was immediate, brutal punishment to re-establish the natural order. But something in Samuel's stillness made Drummond hesitate. Some instinct that whispered this was different, that this man was different. "You're speaking mighty bold for someone who can be whipped within an inch of his life for that tone," Drummond said, trying to reassert control through threat. "You can whip me," Samuel agreed, his voice still eerily calm. "You can whip me until the flesh falls from my bones. But Clara gets proper care first, or I don't work another day on this plantation, not another minute, not another second. You can beat me to death, but you'll get no more labor from me. And Mr. Hewitt will want to know why his property suddenly became worthless." It was masterful psychological warfare, framing the ultimatum in terms of Hewitt's financial interests rather than mercy or justice. Drummond's face worked through several expressions: rage, confusion, calculation. Finally, he spat into the dirt. "Fine. I'll send for the doctor. But you'll work double tasks for a week after this. And if you fail even one, you and your wife both feel the consequences." Samuel nodded once sharply and turned to lift Clara gently from the mud. As he carried her toward the sick house, the other workers parted before him like water. They'd witnessed something unprecedented. A man who'd stared down an overseer and won, however temporarily. The whispers began that very day. The doctor came. A young man named Patterson who rode out from Georgetown that afternoon, more interested in his fee than in his patient. He examined Clara in the sick house, a drafty structure that held 6 rough beds and smelled of old sickness. His examination was cursory, but his conclusion was definitive. "She needs complete bed rest for at least a week, proper nutrition, and no physical labor until after the child is born. The pregnancy is at risk. If you work her, you'll lose both mother and baby." Drummond took this information to Marcus Hewitt that evening. The plantation owner listened to the report while sipping whiskey on his veranda, watching the sun set over his fields. Hewitt was 42 years old, thin-lipped and calculating, a man who viewed enslaved people as livestock, requiring proper management to maximize returns. The loss of a woman and a potential child represented a significant financial setback, but accommodating her needs created its own problems. "Let her rest for a week," Hewitt decided. "But Samuel fulfills both tasks daily or faces punishment. Make it clear this is a one-time accommodation. We cannot have others thinking pregnancy earns them special treatment." What happened over the next week became the subject of stories told in slave quarters across the Low Country for decades afterward. Samuel did the impossible. Every morning before dawn, he went to the fields and completed his own task, a full day's work of rice cultivation that would exhaust any man. Then, as the sun climbed toward noon, he began Clara's task. Other workers watched in awe as he maintained a pace that should have killed him. His hands bled, his back screamed, sweat poured from him in streams that left dark puddles in the mud. But he finished. Every single day he finished both tasks. On the third day, something strange began happening. As Samuel worked alone in the section of field assigned as Clara's task, other enslaved people started drifting over during their brief rest periods. They didn't speak. Speech would draw the attention of the overseers. But they worked. 10 minutes here, 15 minutes there. A row of rice planted while pretending to adjust a tool. Weeds pulled while apparently resting in the shade. It was collective resistance so subtle that the overseers failed to notice it, but it made the difference between Samuel's survival and his collapse. Drummond did notice, though. On the 4th day, he watched from a distance as Samuel received this covert assistance, and his face darkened with understanding. This was the thing overseers feared most: enslaved people acting in concert, building networks of solidarity that undermined the isolation each person was supposed to feel. One defiant man was manageable. A community beginning to organize itself, even in small ways, was dangerous. That evening, Drummond went to cabin 14 and ordered Samuel outside. 3 other overseers waited there, holding torches that cast dancing shadows across the quarters. The message was clear. This would be a public lesson. "You've been getting help in the fields," Drummond said. "That wasn't part of our arrangement. You said you'd do both tasks yourself." "I have done both tasks," Samuel replied carefully. "Every evening you've inspected my work and Clara's work and found both complete. Whatever help I received was freely given during other people's own time, after their tasks were finished. You have no grounds for complaint." It was true, and Drummond knew it. The task system's logic worked against him here. If someone completed their assigned work, their remaining time was theoretically their own. But Drummond wasn't interested in logic. He was interested in re-establishing dominance. "Strip your shirt," Drummond ordered. Samuel hesitated for the first time since this ordeal began. Around them, people emerged from cabins, drawn by the commotion. Clara appeared in the doorway of cabin 14, one hand braced against the frame, her face pale but her eyes fierce. Samuel looked at her, then slowly removed his shirt. His back bore the scars of previous beatings, some old and faded, others more recent. These were the permanent marks of enslavement, the physical records of a lifetime of being someone else's property. Drummond examined those scars by torchlight, then pulled out his whip, a braided leather thing that had tasted hundreds of backs. "This isn't about the work," Drummond said quietly, speaking loud enough for the gathering crowd to hear. "This is about remembering your place, about understanding that we decide when you've earned mercy, not you." The first lash cut across Samuel's shoulders, raising a welt that immediately began to bleed. Samuel didn't cry out. The second blow landed, then the third. Still, Samuel stood silent, his hands clenched into fists at his sides, his jaw locked tight. By the 10th blow, Drummond was breathing hard from exertion and frustration. Enslaved people were supposed to scream, to beg, to be broken by this. Samuel's silence was its own form of resistance, and everyone watching understood this. "Kneel," Drummond ordered. Samuel remained standing. "I said kneel." Drummond's voice cracked with anger. "You can beat me until I can't stand," Samuel said, his voice steady despite the pain that must have been coursing through him. "But I won't kneel. Not for you. Not for any man who thinks he owns me." The crowd of watchers drew in a collective breath. This was sedition of the most dangerous kind, not violent rebellion but philosophical rejection of the entire system. Drummond raised his whip for another blow, but a voice stopped him. "That's enough, Silas." Marcus Hewitt emerged from the darkness beyond the torchlight, having been summoned by a domestic servant who'd witnessed the confrontation beginning. Hewitt approached Samuel slowly, studying him with the expression of someone examining an interesting specimen. "You're quite remarkable," Hewitt said conversationally. "In my experience, pride like yours is either beaten out of a man or it consumes him entirely. Which do you suppose will happen to you?" Samuel met his eyes without flinching. "I reckon time will tell, sir." Hewitt actually smiled at that. "Indeed it will." "Silas, that's sufficient punishment for now. Samuel has fulfilled his obligations. His wife may rest for the remainder of the week as the doctor ordered." He turned to address the crowd. "All of you, back to your cabins. And remember this, mercy is given at our discretion, not demanded as a right. We are generous when we choose to be, but that generosity can be withdrawn just as easily." As the crowd dispersed, Hewitt leaned close to Samuel and spoke in a voice only he could hear. "You have something that worries me. Intelligence and will. That's a dangerous combination in a slave. I'll be watching you very carefully from now on. And trust me when I say you don't want my attention." Clara gave birth 6 weeks later, on October morning when the first hints of autumn finally began to cool the oppressive heat. The child was a girl, born healthy despite all the hardships her mother had endured. They named her Ruth, and for a brief time, something like hope flickered in that cabin. Samuel held his daughter with a tenderness that seemed at odds with the hardness that had grown in him, and Clara sang the same lullabies she'd once sung to the children they'd lost. But hope proved fragile in a place like Fairhaven. In November, Joseph, the plantation's blacksmith, died suddenly of a fever that swept through the quarters. The old man had trained no replacement, and Fairhaven's blacksmith shop stood empty at a time when hundreds of tools needed maintenance and repair. The rice harvest had dulled countless hoes and sickles. Plow blades needed resharpening. Iron hinges and locks throughout the plantation required attention. Marcus Hewitt remembered that Samuel had been advertised as a trained blacksmith. 2 days after Joseph's death, Samuel was reassigned from field work to the forge. On the surface, this seemed like an improvement. Blacksmith work was skilled labor, conducted under a roof, theoretically less physically punishing than rice cultivation. But Hewitt wasn't motivated by mercy. He needed a blacksmith, and Samuel's defiance weeks earlier had marked him as someone requiring close supervision. The forge sat just 50 yards from the main house, within easy view of Hewitt's study window. Samuel approached the forge on his first morning with mixed feelings. Metalwork had been his trade before the endless cycle of sales that had eventually brought him to Fairhaven. He'd learned the craft in Virginia, apprenticed to a skilled blacksmith who'd treated him with something approaching respect. The work had given him a sense of purpose, a way to create rather than simply toil. But that was before Thomas and Mary had been torn from his arms, before Clara had collapsed in the fields, before 10 lashes had stripped skin from his back while Drummond tried to break his spirit. The forge itself was a sturdy brick structure with a high roof to vent smoke and heat. The bellows were well maintained, the anvil solid, the tools organized and comprehensive. Joseph had been a meticulous craftsman, and his workspace reflected that. Samuel ran his hand along the anvil's surface, feeling the countless tiny dents and scratches that recorded years of work. In another life, this would have been a sanctuary. He started slowly, reacquainting himself with the rhythms of the trade. Fire management, building the coal bed to the right temperature, learning the forge's particular quirks. Metal selection, understanding which pieces of scrap iron could be reworked and which were too brittle or flawed. Tool repair, reshaping the damaged implements that had been accumulating since Joseph's death. The work consumed him, providing a temporary escape from the rage that simmered beneath his surface. Drummond checked on him regularly, suspicious of any activity he couldn't fully control. But there was little to observe. Just a man working metal, sweat gleaming on his skin as he hammered hot iron into useful shapes. What Drummond failed to notice were the small items Samuel created during the brief moments when he wasn't working on plantation business. A thin metal file, small enough to hide in a sleeve. A carefully shaped wedge that could pry open a locked door or window. Small pieces of iron wrought into shapes that might serve purposes beyond what any overseer could imagine. December brought colder weather and the end of the harvest season, a time when enslaved people were typically given a few days of relative rest before the cycle began again. Hewitt, in keeping with common plantation practice, announced that Christmas would include 3 days without field labor, along with extra rations of food and a small amount of liquor for the adults. These brief holidays served a cynical purpose. They gave enslaved people just enough relief to prevent total despair, while reinforcing the idea that any mercy came from the master's generosity rather than being a right. On Christmas Eve, Hewitt called Samuel to the main house. This summons sent ripples of anxiety through the quarters. Being called to the house usually meant punishment, special assignment, or bad news. Clara watched her husband walk across the yard with her hand pressed to her mouth, Ruth sleeping against her shoulder. Samuel found Hewitt in his study, a comfortable room lined with books and furnished with dark wood furniture shipped from England. The plantation owner sat behind a massive desk, examining papers by lamplight. He didn't look up when Samuel entered. "Close the door," Hewitt said. Samuel did so, his mind racing through possibilities. The silence stretched out for nearly a minute before Hewitt finally set down his papers and fixed his gaze on Samuel. "Do you know why I brought you here?" Hewitt asked. "No, sir. I wanted to have a conversation, an honest one between two intelligent men." Hewitt leaned back in his chair. You're educated, Samuel. I can see it in the way you speak, the way you think. Someone taught you to read, didn't they? Before you were sold the first time? Samuel said nothing, knowing that literacy among enslaved people was illegal in South Carolina and could result in severe punishment. Hewitt waved his hand dismissively. I don't care about that. What interests me is understanding you. In my years managing this plantation, I've encountered many types of slaves. The ones who are broken from birth, who accept their lot without question. The ones who are broken by experience, whose spirits are crushed gradually. The ones who resist openly and are destroyed for it. And then there are the rare ones like you, people who don't break, who maintain some core of selfhood despite everything we do to strip it away. You fascinate me because you should have been crushed years ago, and yet here you stand, unbroken. Is there a question in all that, sir? Samuel asked carefully. Yes. What would it take to make you accept your position? What would I have to do to transform you from a potential problem into a productive, docile worker? The question hung in the air between them. Samuel understood he was being tested, that his answer mattered in ways he couldn't fully predict. He chose his words with precision. You're asking the wrong question, sir. You can't make me accept slavery, because acceptance would require believing I deserve to be enslaved. And I know I don't. Neither does my wife. Neither did my children before you people sold them away from me. You can force obedience through violence. You can extract labor through threats. But you can't make anyone accept the fundamental injustice of owning another human being. The most you can hope for is that we pretend to accept it while we survive. Hewitt studied him for a long moment, then did something unexpected. He smiled. That's precisely the answer I hoped you'd give, because it confirms my assessment of you. You're dangerous, Samuel. Not because you're violent. Violence is easy to control. You're dangerous because you see clearly, because you understand exactly what this system is, and you refuse to internalize the lie that it's natural or right. Men like you are the reason we have patrols and laws and constant vigilance. You're the nightmare that keeps plantation owners awake at night. If you think I'm so dangerous, why not just sell me? Samuel asked. Because danger can be useful if properly directed. Hewitt stood and walked to the window, looking out over his property. I have a proposition for you. You'll continue working as my blacksmith. You'll train several others in the trade so I'm not dependent on a single person. In exchange, I'll ensure Clara receives lighter work assignments appropriate for a nursing mother. I'll provide your cabin with extra rations, and I'll promise you this, as long as you cause me no trouble, I will not sell you Clara or Ruth separately. Your family stays together. The offer was clever because it exploited the one vulnerability Samuel couldn't armor against, his love for his family. The promise of keeping them together was exactly the kind of incentive that might transform a potential rebel into a compliant worker. Hewitt was offering a devil's bargain, submission in exchange for the thing Samuel wanted most. And if I refuse this generous offer? Samuel asked. Then I sell Clara and Ruth south, Georgia or Alabama, where you'll never see them again. And you remain here working my forge, with nothing but memories and regret to keep you company. You'd become exactly what I need you to be anyway, but you'd have lost everything in the process. Samuel felt the trap close around him. This wasn't really an offer. It was coercion, dressed in the language of negotiation. But what choice did he have? He could refuse on principle and lose his family, or accept the deal and retain some small sphere of safety for them. The choice wasn't really a choice at all. I accept your terms, Samuel said quietly. Excellent. Hewitt returned to his desk and made a note in his ledger. You'll start training others after the new year. And Samuel, don't mistake this arrangement for friendship or respect. You're still my property. This is simply good business, keeping valuable assets productive. Dismiss yourself. Samuel left the study and walked back across the dark yard to cabin 14. Clara met him at the door, her eyes full of questions. He told her about the arrangement, about the protection it offered, and the price it demanded. They held each other in the darkness while Ruth slept nearby, and neither of them spoke about the fact that they'd just accepted chains slightly longer than before, but chains nonetheless. The new year of 1820 began with unusual cold that froze the shallow waters of the rice fields and made the work of preparing for spring planting even more miserable. Samuel spent his days in the relative warmth of the forge, training 3 other enslaved men in the basics of blacksmithing. He taught them methodically fire management, metal properties, basic tool repair, the maintenance of edges and points. The men learned quickly, motivated by the knowledge that this skilled work might save them from the brutal field work that destroyed bodies. But while Samuel's hands worked the forge, his mind worked through a different kind of calculation. The arrangement with Hewitt had bought his family temporary security, but it hadn't changed the fundamental reality of their enslavement. Clara's lighter work assignment could be revoked at any moment. The promise not to sell them separately meant nothing if Hewitt decided to sell them together, or if financial pressures forced a sale, or if Hewitt simply died and they became part of his estate's liquidation. The illusion of security was just that, an illusion. Samuel began to pay attention to things he'd previously ignored. The patrol routes taken by the white men who rode through the area at night, enforcing curfews and hunting for runaways. The schedule of supply deliveries to the plantation, the comings and goings of traders and visitors to Georgetown, the network of roads that connected the plantation to the wider world. He didn't have a specific plan yet, but he was gathering information the way a blacksmith gathers raw materials, not knowing exactly what he'll build, but knowing he'll need resources when the time comes. In February, a man arrived at Fairhaven who would inadvertently provide the catalyst for everything that followed. His name was William Sterling, and he was a slave trader passing through Georgetown on his way north to Virginia. He stopped at Fairhaven to conduct some business with Hewitt, the sale of 3 enslaved people who'd been deemed troublesome on other plantations. Sterling was in his 50s, prosperous and confident, a man who'd built his fortune on human suffering without apparent conscience. Samuel was working at the forge when Sterling rode up to examine the blacksmith's operation. The trader had brought his own blacksmith to look at the setup, considering whether to invest in establishing a similar operation at his holding facility in Richmond. The 2 men stood watching Samuel work for several minutes before Sterling spoke. "You do fine work," he said. "Where'd you learn the trade?" "Virginia, sir," Samuel replied, not looking up from the plowshare he was repairing. "Apprenticed to a smith in Fredericksburg before I was sold south." "Fredericksburg?" Sterling's interest sharpened. "What was your master's name back then?" Something in the trader's tone made Samuel pause. He looked up and found Sterling studying him with an expression that combined recognition and calculation. A cold feeling settled in Samuel's stomach. "I don't recall, sir," Samuel lied. That was many years ago. But Sterling's face had already shifted into certainty. "I do recall, though. Thomas Radcliffe, wasn't it? And you weren't just his blacksmith. You were the one involved in that incident with his son, the boy who died in the stable fire." The forge suddenly felt very small. Samuel's grip tightened on the hammer he was holding, and for a moment the world reduced to the sound of his own heartbeat. That fire had happened 8 years ago. Radcliffe's teenage son, drunk and vicious, had come to the forge one night and attacked Samuel with a riding crop, screaming abuse about some perceived insult. There'd been a struggle. A lantern had fallen. The fire had spread faster than anyone anticipated, consuming the stable and trapping the boy inside before help could arrive. Samuel had been the only witness to what happened, and his testimony as an enslaved man counted for nothing in any legal proceeding. But suspicions had swirled. Radcliffe had sold Samuel within a week, eager to remove any reminder of his son's death. "I don't know what you're talking about, sir," Samuel said carefully. Sterling smiled, and it was the smile of a man who'd just discovered leverage. "Of course you don't. But memories are funny things, aren't they? They have a way of surfacing at inconvenient times. I wonder what Mr. Hewitt would think if he knew his valuable blacksmith had such an interesting history." The threat was clear. Sterling had information that could destroy the fragile stability Samuel had built. If Hewitt learned about the fire and the suspicions surrounding it, he'd sell Samuel immediately. No owner wanted someone who might be a danger to his family or property. And Sterling knew this, was calculating how to profit from this knowledge. That evening, Sterling had dinner with Hewitt at the main house. Samuel didn't know what was discussed, but the next morning, Hewitt summoned him again. "Mr. Sterling has made me aware of some concerning information about your past," Hewitt said without preamble. "He's also made me an offer. He'll pay top dollar to purchase you and take you back to Virginia, where apparently you're wanted for questioning about a fire that killed a white boy." Samuel's blood turned to ice. "I had nothing to do with that boy's death, sir. It was an accident." "Perhaps. But the law in Virginia might see it differently. Sterling seems to think they would." Hewitt paused. "However, I've declined his offer. You're too valuable to me as a blacksmith, and I don't make business decisions based on old rumors. But understand this. If you give me any reason to regret keeping you, if you cause any trouble whatsoever, I will sell you to Sterling without hesitation. Your family stays here, and you go north to face whatever awaits you there." The new threat hung over Samuel like a blade. Sterling remained in Georgetown for 3 more days, conducting his business, and Samuel knew the trader was simply waiting for Hewitt to change his mind. Every moment felt precarious, as if the ground beneath his feet might give way at any second. On Sterling's last night in Georgetown, something happened that changed the trajectory of everything that followed. The trader accepted an invitation to dine with several prominent plantation owners at a tavern in town, a social gathering that included Hewitt and 2 other major landowners. These men drank whiskey and discussed business and politics late into the evening, their voices growing louder as the alcohol flowed. Samuel learned about this gathering the next day from a domestic servant named Rachel, who'd been working at the tavern that night. She told the story in whispers to a small group in the quarters, her voice tight with anger. Sterling had been boasting about his success in the slave trade, telling stories about his methods for breaking difficult cases. He'd described in detail how he handled enslaved people who showed too much spirit or intelligence, techniques involving isolation, strategic violence, and psychological torture designed to destroy the will to resist. But what made Rachel's hands shake as she told this story was Sterling's account of a woman he'd purchased in Charleston the previous year. A woman traveling with 2 children, a boy about 5 and a girl about 3. Sterling had described separating the woman from her children, selling them to different buyers in Georgia, watching the mother's spirit break as she was loaded onto a ship bound for Cuba. He'd laughed while telling this story, describing her screams as entertainment. The description matched Samuel and Clara's children perfectly. The ages, the timing, the location of the sale. When Samuel heard this story, something inside him that had been bent finally snapped. He walked to the forge in a daze, his mind replaying Sterling's words as Rachel had reported them. His children sold away and scattered like seeds in the wind, their fates unknown and likely terrible. Their mother, separated from them and sent to Cuba, where slavery was even more brutal than in the American South. And Sterling, laughing about it over whiskey, treating their suffering as an entertaining anecdote. Samuel stood in the forge for a long time, staring at the fire without seeing it. Then he began to work. His hands moved with purpose now, creating something specific. Over the next 4 hours, working late into the night, long after everyone else had gone to their cabins, he forged something he'd been thinking about for months, but had never allowed himself to actually make. It was a key, or rather, 3 keys, each one carefully shaped to match the locks he'd been studying since his arrival at Fairhaven. One for the plantation's storage shed where extra tools and supplies were kept, one for the tack room where bridles and saddles hung, and one for the door of the smokehouse, which sat close to the perimeter of the plantation grounds. He made them small, easy to conceal, and he tested each one in its lock during the following days, working during the brief moments when no one was watching. Samuel had no specific plan for escape. The odds of successfully fleeing South Carolina were minimal, The penalties for being caught were horrific, and attempting it meant abandoning Clara and Ruth. But he needed to know he could move freely if circumstances demanded it. He needed some small measure of control in a situation designed to strip away all agency. Just when we thought Samuel's situation couldn't become more complex, news arrived that would set events in motion toward their inevitable, terrible conclusion. If this story is giving you chills, share this video with a friend who loves dark mysteries. Hit that like button to support our content, and don't forget to subscribe to never miss stories like this. Let's discover together what happens next. What came next wasn't dramatic or sudden. It was gradual, methodical, and all the more terrifying for its calculated nature. The first incident happened on a March evening, 3 weeks after Sterling's departure. Drummond discovered that his favorite riding crop, a particular piece of braided leather he used for both horses and punishments, had gone missing from the tack room. He flew into a rage, certain that one of the enslaved people had stolen it as an act of petty rebellion. He ordered a search of the quarters, turning over bedding and belongings while people stood by helplessly. The crop was never found. A week later, Marcus Hewitt's hunting dog, a valuable pointer he'd imported from England, was found dead in its kennel. The death appeared natural. The dog was old and had been slowing down for months. But Hewitt insisted on having a veterinarian examine the animal. The veterinarian found nothing definitive but mentioned that some of the symptoms were consistent with consuming oleander, a toxic plant that grew wild around the plantation. 2 weeks after that, Drummond fell ill with a stomach ailment that left him bedridden for 3 days. The doctor diagnosed it as something he'd eaten, perhaps spoiled meat. But the cook swore that all the food served to the overseers had been fresh, and no one else had gotten sick from the same meal. Each incident in isolation seemed unremarkable, the normal accidents and misfortunes that occur on any plantation. But taken together, they formed a pattern that made Hewitt uneasy. He began to suspect deliberate sabotage, though he had no evidence and no clear suspect. He increased patrols, imposed stricter curfews, and watched his enslaved workers with heightened suspicion. Samuel continued his work at the forge, training his apprentices, maintaining his routine. But those who knew him well noticed subtle changes. Clara saw how he sometimes stared into the fire with an expression that frightened her. Rachel observed him working late into the night more frequently, the hammer blows ringing out long after everyone else had sought rest. The other men in cabin 14 remarked on how he'd sometimes wake in the darkness and sit perfectly still for hours, as if engaged in silent communion with something they couldn't see. In May, a traveling preacher arrived in Georgetown, and Methodist minister named Reverend Thompson, who made regular circuits through the Low Country, preaching to both white and enslaved congregations. Hewitt, like many plantation owners, permitted and even encouraged these religious visits, believing that Christianity made enslaved people more docile and accepting of their condition. On a Sunday morning, Thompson preached to Fairhaven's enslaved community in an open area near the quarters. His sermon was drawn from Exodus, the story of the Israelites' enslavement in Egypt and their eventual liberation. Thompson was careful in his presentation, emphasizing obedience and patience, framing the message in ways designed not to inspire rebellion. But the story itself was inherently subversive. It was about enslaved people who'd suffered until God intervened to free them, about a tyrant who'd oppressed them facing divine punishment, about a long journey to freedom through wilderness and hardship. Samuel listened to this sermon with an intensity that made the people around him uncomfortable. When Thompson reached the part about the plagues visited upon Egypt, water turning to blood, livestock dying, darkness covering the land, Samuel's lips moved silently, as if he were memorizing every word. When the preacher described Pharaoh's army drowning in the Red Sea, Samuel's hands clenched into fists. After the service, Samuel approached Thompson privately. "Reverend," he said quietly, "in your reading of Exodus, was Moses justified in killing the Egyptian overseer before God called him to lead the people?" Thompson looked uncomfortable with the question. "That was complicated," Moses fled into exile for that act. It wasn't part of God's plan for liberation. But he did it anyway, Samuel pressed. He saw injustice, and he acted, even though it cost him everything. Brother Samuel, I sense you're troubled. But vengeance belongs to the Lord, not to man. Our suffering in this world is temporary. Justice will come in the next life. And what if waiting for the next life means accepting injustice in this one? Samuel asked. What if patience is just another word for cowardice? Thompson had no good answer for that. He offered some platitudes about faith and endurance, then moved on to speak with other members of the congregation. But the conversation stayed with him, troubling enough that he mentioned it to Hewitt before departing Fairhaven. The plantation owner filed the information away, another small piece of evidence suggesting Samuel was thinking dangerous thoughts. The catalyst came in June, during the height of the growing season when everyone's nerves were frayed by heat and exhausting labor. Clara, who'd been working lighter duties since Ruth's birth, was reassigned to full field work by a new overseer named Jacob Cross, who'd been hired to replace the aging Drummond. Cross was younger, more ambitious, and eager to prove his worth by increasing productivity. He viewed Clara's reduced workload as an indulgence that needed correcting. When Samuel learned of this change, he went directly to Hewitt's study to protest. Sir, you promised Clara would have appropriate work while she's nursing. Sending her to the fields breaks our agreement. Hewitt looked up from his papers with annoyance. That arrangement was made when you were my only blacksmith. Now you've trained 3 others. The situation has changed. Your wife returns to full duties. If you have a problem with that, we can revisit Sterling's offer to purchase you. The threat was clear, but this time Samuel didn't back down. Then revisit it, he said quietly, because I won't stand by while you break your word and destroy my wife's health. The boldness of this statement shocked Hewitt into momentary silence. Enslaved people didn't issue ultimatums, didn't challenge their owners' decisions, didn't speak of agreements as if they had legal weight. This was insurrection of the most fundamental kind, the rejection of the owner's absolute authority. Get out of my house, Hewitt said, his voice dangerously low, and know that you've just sealed your family's fate. That night, Samuel didn't return to Cabin 14. Instead, he went to the forge and worked through the darkness, the sound of hammer on anvil ringing out like a heartbeat. Clara came to find him near midnight, Ruth wrapped in a cloth against her chest. "What are you doing?" she asked, seeing the wild look in his eyes. "I'm making a choice," Samuel said. His hands worked the metal with fierce precision, creating something Clara couldn't quite identify in the dim light. "For 8 years, I've bent. I've submitted. I've swallowed every humiliation because I thought if I just endured long enough, if I just played by their rules, I could keep us safe. But there is no safety. There are no rules, not for us. There's only their whim, their cruelty, and our suffering. Samuel, you're frightening me." He stopped working and looked at her, really looked at her for the first time in weeks. "I know, and I'm sorry, but I can't be what they want me to be anymore. I can't be docile. I can't pretend this is acceptable. Something has to break, Clara. And I've decided it won't be me again." "What does that mean? What are you planning?" Samuel didn't answer directly. Instead, he pulled out a small cloth bundle from where he'd hidden it behind the forge. Inside were the keys he'd made months earlier, along with several other items he'd been collecting, a knife, some rope, a tinderbox. "If something happens to me," he said, "you take Ruth and you go north. Use these keys to get supplies from the storage shed. There's an old canoe hidden in the marsh grass near the south field. I saw it months ago when I was working there. Take it upriver at night when the patrols are sleeping. Follow the stars. Find people who'll help you." "You're talking about running," Clara said, her voice barely a whisper. "They'll kill you if they catch you. They'll kill all of us. Maybe. Or maybe I'll do something that makes running unnecessary." Before Clara could press for more details, footsteps approached the forge. It was Cross, the new overseer, accompanied by 2 other white men Samuel didn't recognize. They carried rifles and looked like they'd been drinking. Well, Cross said with a sneer. "The troublemaker who thinks he can make demands of Mr. Hewitt. You got a lot of nerve, boy. I think it's time someone taught you your place proper." Samuel set down his hammer slowly, his eyes moving between the three men and calculating odds. "It's late," he said evenly. "Whatever you want can wait until morning." "Nah, I don't think it can." Cross stepped closer. "See, Mr. Hewitt told me you need an attitude adjustment, said I should handle it however I see fit. And I think a night in the stocks ought to cool that rebellious spirit of yours." The stocks were a punishment device that held people immobile through the night, exposed to weather and insects and the mockery of anyone who passed by. It was humiliating and painful, designed to break a person's dignity as much as their body. "I won't go to the stocks," Samuel said quietly. Cross laughed. "You don't get a say in it." What happened next occurred so fast that Clara barely processed it. Cross reached for Samuel, intending to grab his arm and force him toward the punishment area. Samuel moved like lightning, his blacksmith's reflexes honed by years of working hot metal. He caught Cross's wrist, twisted it at an angle that made the overseer cry out in pain, and drove his other hand into Cross's throat. Not hard enough to crush the windpipe, but hard enough to send the man staggering backward, gasping for air. The other two men raised their rifles, but Samuel had already moved, putting the forge's anvil between himself and their weapons. "I said I won't go to the stocks," he repeated, his voice still eerily calm. "You can shoot me if you want, but you'll have to answer to Mr. Hewitt for destroying his valuable blacksmith, or you can leave. Come back in the morning with more men if you need to feel brave." It was a standoff that could only end badly. The men were armed. They had legal authority to do anything they wanted to an enslaved person, and Samuel had just committed an act of violence against white men, an offense that carried a mandatory death sentence under South Carolina law. But in that moment, with the forge fire casting dancing shadows and Samuel's eyes burning with something that looked very much like liberation from fear, the men hesitated. Cross, still clutching his throat and wheezing, gestured for his companions to lower their rifles. "You just signed your own death warrant," he rasped. "By morning you'll be hanging from a tree, and your wife and brat will be sold so far south you'll never even be memories to them." Samuel's expression didn't change. "Then you'd better make sure you hang me, because if I survive until morning, I promise you'll regret leaving me alive." The three men backed away, Cross casting murderous looks over his shoulder as they departed. As soon as they were out of sight, Clara grabbed Samuel's arm. "What have you done?" she whispered. "They'll kill you. They'll kill all of us." "They were always going to kill us," Samuel said, and there was a strange peace in his voice now, as if he'd crossed some invisible threshold beyond fear. "Maybe not today or tomorrow, but eventually. This system kills us slowly if we submit, or quickly if we resist. At least this way I got to choose." He pulled Clara close, kissing her forehead, then Ruth's. "Take the keys. Take the supplies. Go tonight. Don't wait. I won't leave you. You have to, for Ruth. Give her the chance I couldn't give Thomas and Mary." The sound of shouting rose from the direction of the main house, Cross raising the alarm, gathering men, preparing to return with overwhelming force. Samuel pressed the cloth bundle into Clara's hands. "Go, now, please." Clara stood there for one more heartbeat, tears streaming down her face. Then she turned and ran into the darkness, clutching Ruth and the bundle of supplies that represented their only chance at survival. Samuel watched her disappear, then turned back to the forge. If they were coming to kill him, he wouldn't make it easy. He stoked the fire hotter, selected his best hammer, and positioned himself where he could see the approaches to the building. In his mind, he was calculating how many men would come, what weapons they'd carry, how he might survive the next hour. The odds were impossibly against him, but he'd been facing impossible odds his entire life. The mob that formed was 15 men strong, carrying torches and weapons, their faces twisted with the particular fury that white men reserved for enslaved people who dared to fight back. They surrounded the forge, and Hewitt himself came forward to speak. "Samuel, come out. This can end peacefully if you surrender now." Samuel laughed at that, a harsh, bitter sound that echoed across the yard. "Peace? You mean my peaceful execution? My peaceful murder while you call it justice? You attacked an overseer. The law is clear about the penalty. Your law, your justice, your system that says you can own people, work them to death, tear their families apart, and face no consequences. I'm done pretending that system has any legitimacy." The crowd murmured angrily at this open sedition. Hewitt's face hardened. "Then you've chosen death. We'll burn you out." And that's what they did. Torches sailed through the air, landing on the forge's wooden roof. The dry pine caught quickly, flames spreading across the structure. Heat intensified rapidly, smoke billowing, making it impossible to breathe. Samuel had perhaps 2 minutes before the fire would consume everything. He made his choice in that moment. He could die in the flames, his end forgotten, his resistance reduced to a cautionary tale told to other enslaved people to discourage rebellion. Or he could give them something to remember, something that would haunt their dreams and make them fear every enslaved person who looked at them with defiant eyes. Samuel grabbed an iron rod from the forge, long, heavy, heated to red-hot temperature by the fire. Then he charged out of the burning building directly into the crowd of men. What happened next was chaos. Samuel swung the burning rod like a weapon, forcing men to scatter, their clothes catching fire where the metal touched them. He broke through their line and ran, not toward the quarters where Clara might be, but toward the rice fields, leading the pursuit away from his family. Men fired rifles into the darkness, but Samuel was fast, fueled by adrenaline and the desperate energy of someone with nothing left to lose. The pursuit lasted through the night, a deadly game of chase through the dark fields and marshlands surrounding Fairhaven. Samuel's knowledge of the plantation's layout served him well. He led the men through difficult terrain, across muddy irrigation ditches, into areas where snakes and alligators made pursuit dangerous. Several men were injured in the chase. One fell into a ditch and broke his leg. Another was bitten by a water moccasin and had to be carried back to the plantation. As dawn broke, Samuel had successfully evaded capture for 7 hours, an almost unthinkable feat that would be talked about for years afterward. But exhaustion was catching up with him, and the men hunting him had been reinforced by slave catchers from neighboring plantations. Dogs had been brought in, their baying voices cutting through the morning air. Samuel made his final stand in a grove of cypress trees near the edge of Hewitt's property, his back to a massive tree trunk, the iron rod still clutched in his hands. When the men finally surrounded him, he was covered in mud, bleeding from several cuts, but still standing with that same fierce defiance that had defined him from the beginning. "Shoot him!" someone shouted. But Hewitt, who'd followed the pursuit, held up his hand. "No. He's destroyed valuable property, injured several men, led us on a hunt that's wasted a night's work from everyone on this plantation. He doesn't get a quick death. He gets an example." They took Samuel to Georgetown's public square, where executions and severe punishments were carried out as community spectacles. A post had been erected specifically for this purpose, and Samuel was tied to it while hundreds of people gathered to watch. The penalty for his crimes was legally clear: whipping until death, a punishment that could take hours to complete, meant to be so terrible that it would discourage any other enslaved person from similar resistance. But before the punishment could begin, something unexpected happened. Clara appeared at the edge of the crowd, Ruth in her arms, flanked by 2 enslaved men from Fairhaven. She hadn't run as Samuel had ordered. She'd hidden through the night, and when dawn came, she'd made the choice to be present for whatever came next. "I want to see him," she called out, her voice clear and strong. "I have the right to say goodbye to my husband." The crowd murmured. Technically, she had no rights at all, but there was something in her bearing, some dignity, that made even the angry mob hesitate. Hewitt, perhaps seeking to display magnanimity that would make the subsequent execution seem more just, gestured for her to approach. Clara walked through the parted crowd to where Samuel was tied to the post. Their eyes met, and in that moment, an entire conversation passed between them without words. She touched his face gently, then spoke loud enough for everyone to hear. "You are the bravest man I have ever known," she said. "You never bent. You never broke. You never accepted that they had the right to own us. And because of that, you're free in ways they will never understand. Our daughter will know your name. She'll know what you fought for. She'll know that her father died standing up rather than living on his knees." Then she did something that sent a shock through the assembled crowd. She kissed him, long and tender in full view of everyone. It was an assertion of their humanity, their love, their marriage, all things the system of slavery sought to deny. It was an act of rebellion as profound in its way as Samuel's violent resistance had been. When Clara stepped back, Samuel looked out at the crowd of white faces, many of them contorted with anger or disgust or fear. He spoke then, his voice carrying across the square. "You think you're about to punish one difficult slave. You're not. You're creating a story that will be told in every slave quarter in South Carolina. You're making me into something you can't control, a memory, an example, a promise that resistance is possible. You can destroy my body, but you can't destroy what I represent. And there are hundreds like me, thousands, all of us just waiting for our moment. You should be afraid, because we are coming." The whipping began moments later. What happened during those next hours was too brutal to describe in detail, designed to break not just Samuel's body but his spirit, to reduce him to begging and pleading for the mercy that would never come. But witnesses later said that Samuel never screamed, never begged, never gave them the satisfaction of his complete degradation. He endured in silence, his eyes fixed on some distant point beyond the crowd, beyond the pain, beyond the moment. He died as the sun reached its highest point, still tied to that post, still defiant in death as he had been in life. His body was left there for 2 days as a warning to any other enslaved person who might think of resistance. Clara was sold 3 days later, along with Ruth, to a planter in Georgia. But she kept her promise. She told her daughter about Samuel, about his strength and his sacrifice. And Ruth told her own children years later, after emancipation finally came. The story spread through the generations, changing and evolving, but always maintaining its core truth, that there had been a man who refused to accept slavery, who fought back even when it cost him everything, who died free in spirit even as he remained enslaved in body. The plantation records from Fairhaven show an unusual gap in 1820. Several pages have been torn out of the ledgers for that year, removing any official record of Samuel's existence or his death. Marcus Hewitt died in 1831, and local accounts suggest he became increasingly paranoid in his final years, sleeping with weapons near his bed, starting at shadows. The forge at Fairhaven was never rebuilt. The site was left empty as if some unspoken agreement had been reached that it was better to let that place remain abandoned. In Georgetown's historical archives, there's a letter written in 1867 by a formerly enslaved woman who'd lived on Fairhaven as a child. She wrote about the stories the older people used to tell in the quarters, stories about a man who'd been so dangerous that his own name had been forbidden to speak aloud. "We called him the man who stood," she wrote, "and we told ourselves that if he could stand against them, then maybe someday we all could." This mystery shows us that the most dangerous person in any unjust system isn't the one who rebels violently, but the one who refuses to internalize the lie that the system is legitimate. Samuel's resistance wasn't just about his individual freedom. It was about rejecting the entire philosophical foundation of slavery, refusing to accept that any person could rightfully own another. What do you think of this story? Do you believe everything was revealed? Was Samuel a hero, a martyr, or simply a man pushed beyond endurance? Leave your comment below. If you enjoyed this tale and want more stories about forgotten resistance and buried history, subscribe, hit the notification bell, and share with someone who loves mysteries that challenge how we understand the past. The truth isn't always comfortable, but it's always worth knowing.